One of the concerns about renewable energy is that sources such as solar and wind can't provide stable, reliable source of power.
We're going to have batteries everywhere in the system, so the collective batteries in our vehicles is going to be a huge amount of storage.
Through this workshop series, we will guide participants through identifying what climate change means to their neighborhood and then turning that into their own visions of what their neighborhood can look like if it's more climate friendly.
I'm hoping to act on climate change as soon as possible and make a better future.
CBC has spent $131,000 on a personal driver for CBC executives since 2019. Spending on the high-carbon private driver service included $45,000 in 2020 alone, back when the CBC was screaming for COVID lockdowns to stay home, to stay safe, all imposed on ordinary people. As you'll recall, CBC is accused of tailoring the news to scare people into staying home. All this is according to CBC reporter Marianne Klawick, who testified at the Independent National Citizens Inquiry into the government's COVID response.
As a veteran journalist, I had solid contacts in the community. I had people calling me with stories. So I was seeing and I was hearing and I was absorbing all their stories of suffering and pain, and they were sharing them with me, and these stories weren't being told. Some of those were from the vaccine injured. Some were from people who had lost their job because of their vaccination status, those whose families had been blown apart and they'd been ostracized, university students who were depressed over repeated lockdowns and mandates, and parents who were calling me that were agonizing on whether they should vaccinate their child or not. So all these stories were sitting inside of me, they were left with me, and I felt the crushing burden and the weight of their truth not being given a voice. And it affected my well-being because these people trusted me, and I felt I had failed them and I had let them down.
But behind closed doors, we now know that CBC's management team was a bunch of high-mileage hypocrites, ignoring their own mantras of both climate and COVID fear. Now, the data for this story today was obtained through an examination of the proactive releases of previous access filings by the federal government. To support Rebel News' independent investigations through access filings, you can make a donation at rebelinvestigates.com. What we see through these newly released documents is that taxpayers have been covering the costs of CBC executives to be driven around in a Ford Explorer SUV. Not one of those small egg-shaped electric abominations of a car like those people at the CBC want the rest of us to drive. CBC says they eventually abolished the $45,000 per year private driver job, and now they just hire it out on contract for another $4,400 in 2022 and $6,000 in 2023. Look at this. The full-time position was abolished in 2020 due to COVID. The services were contracted on an as-required basis in 2022. I guess that's a win for fiscal accountability to the tune of roughly $40,000 per year. But the CBC, well, they aren't driving less, as I understand. They're just driving smarter. And I know that SUV they were being chauffeured around in, well, it wasn't a hybrid because I can see the fuel costs. The old climate emergency CBC is spending 11 times more on gasoline for that car at $6,600 than they did for ethanol at $600. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. To support Rebel News' independent investigations into all levels and layers of government, including the CBC, please consider making a donation at a special website, rebelinvestigates.com. And thanks in advance to everyone who makes this important work possible.